يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Islamic Creed, level 3, and talking about a shirk, which is the worst thing that can ever happen to someone, to fall wal-'adhu billah in associating partners with Allah, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perfected this religion, that He stopped and forbade anything that would lead the person to fall into the shirk. And this is by the mercy of Allah, so that you would find things that are forbidden, so that it doesn't lead the person to falling into the major shirk, wal-'adhu billah. And one of which is the subject of the graves and those who are dead, and seeking blessings from them and the like of this, exalting it. This issue of dealing with those who passes away is a serious matter, because those who passed away, we have in the Shara, in the Deen of Islam, of how to deal with them, and to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them, for their forgiveness, to go to the graves, to visit them. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, كنت قد نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها. I used to forbade you from visiting the graves, but now visit the graves. فإنها تذكركم الآخرة, because it reminds you of the hereafter. So you visit the graves to remember the hereafter for your own benefit, and to benefit those who are dead by making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive their sins. But to go to the graves to benefit yourself from the graves, from the dead people, that they would benefit you, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you, or you make dua to them, this is all shirk, associating partners with Allah. Prophet ﷺ never done such a thing. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, this is ways of Iblis that he makes people fall into the shirk, wal-'adhu billah. That's why when the Prophet ﷺ, when he was dying, in the last moments of the Prophet ﷺ on the face of earth, he warned against this. And he said, لعنة الله على اليهود والنصارى اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجد يحذر ما صنعوا. The hadith in Bukhari and Muslim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed the Jews and the Christians when they took the graves of their prophets as places of worship, warning against what they've done. So the Prophet ﷺ warned his ummah from this. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, if it wasn't for that statement of the Prophet ﷺ, they would have made his grave of the Prophet ﷺ shown to the people, and people would then do things. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ feared for them to take it as a place of worship. So this is how the Prophet ﷺ warned his ummah. And he said ﷺ in his dua, اللهم لا تجعل قبري وثنا لعن الله قوما اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجد. O Allah, do not make my grave as a wathan, as an idol to be worshipped. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala curses those who would take the graves of their prophets as places of worship. And he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam made it very clear what is the level of those who take the graves as places of worship. And when Habiba and Salama radiallahu anhunna, they mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ when they went to Abyssinia, and they described a church that they saw there in Abyssinia. It has all kinds of images in it. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ أُولَٰئِكَ إِذَا كَانَ فِيهِمُ الرَّجُلُ الصَّالِحِ فَمَاتْ بَنَوْا عَلَى قَبْرِهِ مَسْجِدًا. These people, if a righteous man is among them and he dies, they would build a place of worship on his grave. وَصَوَّرُوا فِيهِ تِلْكَ الصُّوَرِ, and they would draw these images. فَأُولَٰئِكَ شِرَارُ الْخَلْقِ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. These are the most evil people in the day of Al-Qiyamah, in the day of resurrection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because they associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the point here is they built on top of these graves places of worship. So that also refutes the statements of those who say, we don't worship these graves, we don't make sujood on the graves. But the hadith says they built on top of the graves places of worship, like these masajid that are built on the graves. That's why it's a consensus among the imam of the deen that it's not permissible to build masajid, mosques on top of the graves, and not to hang on it all kinds of things, or making vows, hanging images, making vows in the masajid, for those who, having graves and making vows to it, or putting, things like gold and silver and things like this. All of these things can lead, wal'iyadhu billah, to associating partners with Allah. So, and the statements of the ulama in this are so many. And the Prophet ﷺ made it very clear. And he, even with how the graves should be, he forbade ﷺ for people from building the grave, making it bricks and cement and things like this, and elevating it from the ground, and taking it as a place of worship. And he even forbade for people to pray in the graveyard. And he said, لا تجعلوا بيوتكم قبورا. Do not make your homes as a graveyard. That means you don't pray in your home, because the graveyard is not a place for you to make salah, to make worship in it. To make salah in the graves, it's forbidden. Why? All of that is to cut the leads that people would fall into associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he also forbade, this is the statements of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Not those who follow their desires and they say that, or they claim that they love the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. If you love him, follow his words and his hadith. When the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam forbade for people to take the graves as Zidan, that means you keep on going to it and you keep on visiting it or traveling to it. Otherwise, this becomes a means of associating partners with Allah. Right? And the same thing when the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لا تشد الرحال إلا لثلاثة مساجد. It is not permissible to travel for worship except to 3 masajid. Other than these 3 masajid, it is not permissible to travel to a masjid thinking there is virtue in it, like people would do. Only the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, and the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ in Al-Medina, and the Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And the Prophet ﷺ made the matter very clear. And the warnings is not just 1 or 2, all the time. And that's why, as the hadith of Ali radiallahu anh, he said to Abil Hayyaj al-Asadi, that he said to him, أَلَا أَبْعَثُكَ عَلَى مَا بَعَثَنِي عَلَيْهِ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم. Should I make you upon what the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent me with and invite me and called me to be upon? What is it? أَلَّا تَدَعَ تِمْثَالًا إِلَّا طَمَسْتَ وَلَا قَبْرًا مُشْرِفًا إِلَّا سَوَيْتَ. Do not leave a statue of a living thing, of course, unless you would wipe it away, the head, Surah Al-Ra's, as the Prophet ﷺ, he said, these idols, these statues, and the same thing, do not leave a grave that is built up or higher than on the ground unless you would level it. And the only thing that is permissible is to be 1 hand span and not built, but rather with dirt and things like this, and to mark it as a grave with a piece of stone or something, and he forbade writing on it. The Prophet ﷺ forbade people writing on their graves and to build it and to sit on it. All of that is to protect the people from falling into associating partners with Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. This is the way of Iblis, this is the way of Shaitan, and Shaitan knows what's in the hearts of the people. And they tend to fall into these extreme acts of deviation. And the same thing to pray to the graves. لا تصلوا إلى القبور ولا تجلسوا عليها. If you're in the graveyard and the time for the salah comes, it's forbidden to pray in the graveyard. You have to leave, you have to go outside. Why? Because of the Prophet ﷺ forbade that. So this is something that a person has to stay away from such a thing. Traveling to the graves, as we heard the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So many things, as you see, these are dhara'i', or these are means that can lead the people to the worst thing ever. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perfected the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when people do not take these matters seriously, then they cannot protect themselves from falling into the major sins or the major shirk wal-'adhu billah as a result of overlooking these commands of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from all harm and to make us among those who are upon the tawheed, the pure tawheed, and to protect us from shirk. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.